Chapter 1. Prologue. An empire at its peak. Picture, if you will, the world as it existed 25 centuries ago. The year is 525 BC. The Mediterranean basin glows with the light of empires rising and falling like the tide. And among them all, one power stands supreme, stretching from the shores of the Aegean to the banks of the Indus River. The Persian Empire, under the rule of Cambyses II, son of the legendary Cyrus the Great. Persia had become something the world had never quite seen before, a superpower that swallowed kingdoms whole and digested them into a single, sprawling administrative machine. Cities that had stood for 1,000 years now paid tribute to a distant throne. Ancient dynasties bent the knee. The Persians didn't just conquer territory, they conquered the very idea of resistance. And nowhere was this more evident than in Egypt. Egypt, the land of pyramids and pharaohs, a civilization so old that even to the Persians, it seemed to belong to another age entirely. For 3,000 years, Egypt had stood as a beacon of stability and power along the Nile, a kingdom blessed by gods, ruled by living deities, protected by desert and river and the sheer weight of tradition. But in 525 BCE, all of that changed. Cambyses brought his armies across the Sinai, and Egypt, ancient, proud, eternal Egypt, fell to Persia in a series of brutal, decisive campaigns. The Battle of Pelusium shattered the Egyptian forces. Memphis, the great capital, opened its gates. The pharaoh Psamtik III was captured, humiliated, and eventually executed. The two lands of Upper and Lower Egypt, unified for millennia, became just another province, a satrapy, in the vast Persian administrative system. On paper, the conquest was complete. Persian governors installed. Persian soldiers garrisoned in Egyptian cities. Persian gold flowing into Persian treasuries. Egypt had been added to the empire, a jewel in Cambyses' crown, proof that even the most ancient powers could not stand against the might of Persia. But conquest, as Cambyses would soon learn, is not the same as legitimacy. You see, to rule Egypt was not simply to occupy its cities or control its wealth. To truly rule Egypt, you had to be recognized by its gods. The pharaoh was not merely a king. He was a divine figure, the living embodiment of Horus, the son of Ra, the intermediary between the mortal and immortal worlds. Without the blessing of Egypt's gods, you were just another foreign warlord, sitting on someone else's throne. And this is where our story truly begins, not with the conquest itself, but with what happened after. Deep in the western desert, far beyond the green ribbon of the Nile, there existed a place of profound spiritual significance, the Siwa Oasis, an isolated sanctuary of palm trees and springs, surrounded by an ocean of sand and stone. And at its heart stood the Oracle of Ammonius, one of the most revered religious sites in all of Egypt. Ammonius, the Hidden One, the King of Gods, the creator deity who had merged with Ra to become Ammonius Ra, the supreme power of the Egyptian pantheon. To be recognized by the Oracle of Ammonius was to receive divine confirmation of your right to rule. Pharaohs had made pilgrimages to Siwa for centuries, seeking the god's blessing and legitimacy. But the Oracle of Ammonius at Siwa had a problem with Cambyses. The priests of Ammonius, speaking with the voice of their god, questioned whether this Persian conqueror, this foreign king, who worshipped Ahura Mazda, not the gods of Egypt, had any legitimate claim to the title of pharaoh. They did not recognize his authority. They did not accept his divine right. From their sanctuary in the desert, protected by distance and sanctity, they represented a living challenge to Cambyses' rule. And for a king like Cambyses, a man who had inherited not just his father's empire but his father's ambitions, his father's need to be seen as chosen by the divine, this was intolerable. Cambyses was not a man who accepted challenges to his authority lightly. Ancient sources describe him as proud, volatile, perhaps even unbalanced. Though we must be careful here, as many of these sources were written by Greeks who had their own reasons to portray Persian kings as tyrants. But what seems clear is that Cambyses took the divine aspects of kingship very seriously. He had already begun styling himself as pharaoh, adopting Egyptian titles, participating in Egyptian religious ceremonies. He wanted to be seen not as a conqueror, but as the legitimate successor to 3,000 years of Egyptian kingship. But the Oracle of Ammonius said no. From the depths of the western desert, the priests of Siwa denied him what he most desired: recognition, legitimacy, the stamp of divine approval. And in doing so, they issued a challenge that Cambyses, given his nature and his position, simply could not ignore. He would have to silence the oracle. He would have to demonstrate, beyond any doubt, that no power, not even a god hidden in the desert, could question the authority of the King of Kings, the ruler of the Persian Empire, the new pharaoh of Egypt. And so Cambyses made a decision that would lead to one of history's most enduring mysteries. He would send an army into the desert, 50,000 men, soldiers, support staff, guides, a massive force by any standard, but especially for a desert expedition. Their mission: march west from Thebes, cross the endless expanse of sand and stone, find the Siwa oasis, and destroy the oracle of Ammonius. Erase this challenge to Persian authority. Silence the voice of the god who dared to question a king. It should have been straightforward. Difficult, certainly. The western desert was no garden path, but achievable. Armies had crossed deserts before. Civilizations had thrived in these very sands. With proper planning, adequate supplies, and experienced guides, there was no reason to expect disaster. 50,000 men marched west from Thebes into the western desert, and then they vanished. Not defeated, not captured, not turned back by hardship or disease. Vanished. All of them. Every single soldier, every officer, every guide, every pack animal. As if the desert itself had opened up and swallowed them whole, then closed again without leaving a trace. No survivors straggled back to tell of what happened. No bodies were found. No abandoned equipment, no mass grave, no evidence of battle or disaster. Just nothing. Silence. A blank space where 50,000 human beings used to be. This is the mystery we're going to explore together. The mystery of the Lost Army of Cambyses. A story that begins with the arrogance of empire and ends. Well, it doesn't end. That's the problem. The story never ends because we never found out what happened. But we're going to walk through everything we know, examine every theory, and follow the search for answers that has continued for 2,500 years, right up to the present day. So settle in. Get comfortable. Let the world around you fade away for a while. And let's journey back to a time when empires were young, deserts were vast and unmapped, and 50,000 men could walk into the sand and disappear from history forever. Our story begins with power and certainty, but it won't stay there for long. Chapter 2. The mission that should never fail. The decision was made. The oracle of Ammonius at Siwa would be silenced. Now came the question of how. Cambyses was not a fool, whatever his enemies might have said about him. He understood that sending men into the western desert was not like marching across the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia or the coastal plains of Egypt. This was a different kind of warfare entirely, a war against geography itself, against heat and thirst and the infinite, unforgiving emptiness of sand. The desert did not care about your titles or your empire. It did not recognize the authority of kings. The desert killed rich and poor, Persian and Egyptian, soldier and civilian with perfect, impartial efficiency. To survive it, you needed more than courage. You needed planning, preparation, and profound respect for the power of the landscape. And so Cambyses ordered the assembly of a force that would be impossible to stop. A force so large, so well-equipped, so thoroughly prepared that no challenge, human or natural, could stand in its way. 50,000 men. Let that number sink in for a moment. 50,000. In the ancient world, that wasn't just an army. That was a moving city, a human migration. To put it in perspective, the entire population of Athens at this time was perhaps 40,000 people. Cambyses was sending more soldiers into the desert than there were citizens in one of the greatest city-states of Greece. This wasn't a raiding party or a reconnaissance force. This was a statement, a demonstration of power so overwhelming that even the gods themselves would have to take notice. The force assembled at Thebes, the ancient capital of Upper Egypt, the city of 100 gates. Thebes, where the temples of Karnak and Luxor stood as monuments to Egyptian divine kingship. It was fitting, in a way, gathering the army that would crush the oracle of Ammonius in the shadow of Ammonius' own greatest temples. Perhaps Cambyses intended the symbolism. Perhaps he wanted the Egyptian gods to see what was coming. But who exactly were these 50,000 men? They weren't just ordinary infantry, conscripts pulled from farms and villages. No, this expedition was important enough, prestigious enough, or perhaps dangerous enough, to merit the inclusion of elite troops. Among the 50,000 were units of the famous immortals. The immortals, the pride of the Persian military, so named because their numbers were always maintained at exactly 10,000. When one fell in battle or died of disease, he was immediately replaced, so that the unit itself seemed eternal, undying. They were the emperor's own guard, the finest soldiers in the empire, equipped with the best weapons, the best armor, trained to a standard that few armies in the ancient world could match. If you were including immortals in your expedition, you were taking it seriously. These men would have been equipped for desert warfare as well as any force of that era could be. Lighter armor than usual, perhaps, to cope with the heat. Extra water carriers. Provisions calculated for a journey of weeks. They would have brought guides, Egyptians who knew the desert, who had traveled the caravan routes, who understood the rhythms of the sand and the locations of the oases that dotted the wasteland like islands in an ocean. The logistics alone would have been staggering. 50,000 men need food and water. Lots of it. A human being in the desert heat can drink several gallons of water per day just to stay functional. Do the math. 50,000 men, multiple gallons per person per day. A journey expected to take weeks. You're talking about millions of gallons of water. Even with oases along the route, the army would need to carry tremendous supplies. And it wasn't just the men. There would have been pack animals, donkeys, camels, horses, to carry the extra supplies and equipment. These animals need water too, often even more than humans. The supply chain for an expedition like this would have stretched back to Thebes and beyond, requiring careful coordination, advanced preparation, stockpiling at key points along the route. This was the kind of operation that required months of planning. Quartermasters calculating rations, engineers studying maps, such as they were in 525 BC. Local experts being consulted about seasonal conditions, about the reliability of different water sources, about the risks and dangers of the western desert, and the route itself, more than 400 miles from Thebes to Siwa. 400 miles of sand, rock, and occasional oasis. 400 miles where a wrong turn, a missed water source, or a sudden sandstorm could turn victory into catastrophe. But the Persians were confident. They had reason to be. They had conquered most of the known world. Their armies had marched from the Indus to the Mediterranean, adapting to mountains, rivers, deserts, forests. They had logistics down to a science. They had experience. They had elite troops. They had resources that dwarfed those of any potential enemy. What could possibly go wrong? There's something else worth considering here, though. Something beyond the purely military and logistical aspects of the expedition. This mission was about more than just destroying a sanctuary or killing some priests. It was about destroying prophecy itself. Think about what the oracle represented. It wasn't just a political challenge to Cambyses' authority, though it was certainly that. It was something more fundamental. The oracle claimed to speak with the voice of a god. It claimed access to divine knowledge, to truths that kings could not control or manipulate. It represented a power that existed outside the normal hierarchy of empire, a power that could not be bribed or threatened or conquered in the usual ways. By sending an army to Siwa, Cambyses was attempting something remarkable and terrible. He was trying to silence divine speech itself, to demonstrate that no power, earthly or celestial, stood above the authority of the Persian throne. The oracle said he had no right to rule Egypt. He would erase the oracle. The god questioned his legitimacy. He would destroy the god's house and scatter the god's priests. It was hubris, in the classical Greek sense, the dangerous pride that makes mortals think they can challenge the divine order, the arrogance that inevitably brings down heroes and kings in ancient literature. But Cambyses, apparently, didn't read Greek tragedy, or perhaps he did, and simply didn't believe it applied to him. After all, he was the king of kings, the ruler of the greatest empire the world had ever seen. His father had conquered from horizon to horizon. His armies had never known defeat. Why should the gods trouble themselves about one more Persian victory? And so the army assembled, 50,000 strong. The immortals polished their spears. The pack animals were loaded. The water vessels were filled. The guides plotted the route, marking the oases where the army would rest and resupply. Officers reviewed their commands. Soldiers said goodbye to their families, though most probably expected this to be routine. Just another march, just another conquest. The order was given. The army marched west from Thebes. At first, everything proceeded according to plan. The ancient historian Herodotus, writing less than a century later, tells us that the army reached the oasis of El-Kurgar, a major watering point about a week's march into the desert. There, they rested, refilled their water supplies, and prepared for the next leg of the journey. From El-Kurgar, they would continue west and slightly north, deeper into the desert, toward the next oasis, and then the next, following the chain of water sources that would eventually lead them to Siwa. The first stage was complete. The army was intact, supplied, and on schedule. Officers sent word back to Thebes, or perhaps to Cambyses himself, wherever he was at the time, that the expedition was proceeding as planned. Everything was going perfectly. 50,000 men, elite soldiers, experienced officers, knowledgeable guides, proper equipment, adequate supplies. A mission carefully planned and confidently executed. The first objective reached without incident. What could possibly go wrong? They left El-Kurgar Oasis and marched deeper into the western desert, and that was the last time anyone ever saw them. Not one of those 50,000 men would ever return to Thebes. Not one would ever report back to Cambyses. Not one would ever tell the story of what happened next. The army that was too large to fail, too well equipped to be stopped, too powerful to simply disappear. Disappeared. Completely. Absolutely. Without a trace. And the silence they left behind has echoed through history for 2,500 years. Chapter 3. Marching into the unknown. To understand what might have happened to the Lost Army, we need to put ourselves in their place. We need to imagine what it was like to be one of those 50,000 men, marching west from El-Kurgar into the vast emptiness of the western desert. Picture it. You're a soldier in the Persian army, perhaps one of the elite immortals, or perhaps just a regular infantryman. You've trained for battle, for sieges, for campaigns across mountain and river and plain. You've marched hundreds of miles before. You've fought in foreign lands. You're no stranger to hardship. But this is different. The western desert of Egypt is one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Not the most hostile. There are hotter deserts, drier deserts, more mountainous deserts. But the western desert has a quality that goes beyond mere statistics. It's the emptiness, the absolute, crushing vastness of it. An ocean of sand and stone that stretches from the Nile to the Atlantic, 3,000 miles of nothing. And you're walking into it with 50,000 other men, following a route that depends entirely on finding water sources separated by days of marching. The oases. That's the key to everything. The entire expedition depended on a fragile chain of oases scattered across the desert, like beads on a string. El-Kurgar, where the army was last seen. Then perhaps Bahariya, to the northwest. Or maybe Dakhla, further south and west. The exact route is uncertain. We don't have the original orders, and the ancient accounts are vague about the details. But what we do know is this. Each oasis was days of hard marching from the next. And between them, nothing. Just sand, rock, heat, and sky. These oases weren't lush tropical paradises. They were small pockets of water and date palms, surrounded by endless desert. Some could support a small permanent population. Others were just springs or wells. Barely enough water for a caravan, let alone an army. The army would have had to carefully manage its approach. You couldn't just have 50,000 men descend on a small oasis at once. The water supply would be overwhelmed. You'd need to send advance parties, establish camps, ration the water, maintain discipline, while men desperate with thirst waited their turn. And all of this depended on actually finding the oases. In theory, the army had guides, men who knew the desert, who had traveled these routes before with caravans, men who could read the landscape, who knew where to find water, who understood the rhythms and dangers of the sand. But even the best guides face challenges that would be hard for us to imagine today, with our GPS and satellite imagery and detailed maps. Ancient maps, if they even had them, were unreliable at best. They weren't scale drawings based on precise measurements. They were more like sketches, memory aids. 3 days west of El Kurga, look for the Twin Hills. The oasis is beyond them, near where the rock turns red. That kind of thing. And the desert doesn't cooperate with that kind of navigation. Landmarks disappear. Sand dunes shift with the wind, moving dozens of feet in a single storm. What was a distinctive hill last year might be half buried this year. The rock formations that guided travelers could be obscured by sand or haze, or the shimmering distortions of heat. Speaking of heat, let's talk about what these men were facing physically. The western desert in summer, and we don't know exactly what season they marched, but it was probably summer or late spring, can reach temperatures of 50 degrees Celsius. That's 122 degrees Fahrenheit. In the sun, on the sand, it can feel even hotter. Imagine marching in that heat. Now imagine marching in that heat while wearing armor. Persian soldiers weren't heavily armored by medieval standards, but they weren't unprotected either. Bronze or iron helmets, leather or linen armor, perhaps reinforced with metal scales, shields, weapons, supplies. Each man carrying his share of the load. Metal absorbs heat. Leather stiffens and cracks in extreme dryness. Even cloth becomes unbearable when the sun beats down hour after hour, with no shade, no relief, no escape. And the sand. The sand gets everywhere. In your eyes, your nose, your throat, in the joints of your armor, in your water skin, in your food. The fine dust particles work their way into everything, grinding against skin, causing irritation and infection. Your feet blister and crack. Your lips split. Your skin burns despite any protection you might have. Men marching in those conditions would need enormous amounts of water. Not the sips we might imagine, but gallons per day just to stay functional. Dehydration comes fast in that kind of heat. First you stop sweating, your body trying to conserve water. Then comes the headache, the dizziness, the confusion. Your blood thickens. Your heart struggles. Eventually, your organs begin to shut down. And water was limited. They would have carried water in animal skins, goat or sheepskin vessels that could hold several gallons. But these have problems. They're heavy when full. Water weighs about 8 pounds per gallon. They can leak, especially in the heat. They can burst if mishandled. And once they're empty, there's no refilling them until you reach the next oasis. The army would have brought pack animals, donkeys, camels, horses, to carry extra water and supplies. But these animals have their own needs. A camel can survive longer without water than a human, but it still needs water. A donkey needs even more, and more frequently. Horses, beautiful and useful in normal warfare, are terrible desert animals. High water needs, poor heat tolerance, easily panicked. As the animals died, and they would die from heat, thirst, exhaustion, or disease, the army's carrying capacity would shrink. Each dead animal meant less water could be transported, which meant harder rationing, which meant more stress on the remaining animals and men, which meant more deaths, which meant less carrying capacity. A downward spiral, if things started to go wrong. And according to the accounts, fragmentary as they are, things did start to go wrong. The scouts vanished. This detail appears in some versions of the story, and it's chilling if true. The army would have sent scouts ahead, small, fast-moving parties on camels or horses, tasked with finding the route, locating the next oasis, reporting back on conditions. Standard military practice for any force moving through unfamiliar territory. But the scouts didn't come back. Maybe they got lost. Maybe they found an oasis and decided not to return, a grim form of desertion. Maybe they died of thirst. Maybe they encountered hostile locals and were killed. We don't know. But imagine what that meant for the army. You're marching west, following a route that depends on finding water sources you can't see. Your scouts, your eyes, your early warning system, have disappeared. Do you keep going? Do you turn back? Do you send more scouts, risking more men? The officers would have consulted their guides. How far to the next oasis? Are we on the right path? But how certain could the guides be? In a landscape where everything looks the same, where the usual landmarks might be buried or distorted, where the heat creates mirages that turn the sky into a shimmering sea of false images. Mirages. Let's talk about those for a moment, because they're not just optical illusions, they're psychological torture in the desert. When hot air near the ground meets cooler air above, light bends. Your brain interprets this as water, a lake, a pool, always just ahead, always receding as you approach. Every man in that army would have seen these phantom waters. Every man would have known intellectually that they weren't real. But when you're desperately thirsty, when your throat is cracked leather and your tongue is swollen, when you've been marching for days with strictly rationed water, knowledge isn't enough. The mirage calls to you. Some men would have broken ranks, stumbling toward the false water, wasting precious energy and time. Some might have never found their way back to the column. And worse than mirages of water were mirages of landmarks. Heat distortion can make distant hills appear closer or farther away. It can make flat ground look elevated, or create the illusion of structures that don't exist. Navigating by visual landmarks in those conditions would have been a nightmare even for experienced guides. The shifting dunes made it worse. The western desert isn't all flat sand. There are massive dune fields where the sand piles up into hills hundreds of feet high. These dunes move, slowly by human standards, but constantly. Wind pushes sand up one side, and it avalanches down the other. Over weeks and months and years, entire dunes march across the landscape like slow waves. A landmark that existed when the guides last came through might be buried now. A clear path might be blocked by a new dune. The safe route might have become impassable. And at night, because the army would have rested during the worst heat of the day and marched in early morning and evening when possible. At night, the desert transforms again. The temperature plummets. The same desert that baked you alive during the day can drop to near freezing at night. Men who had been desperate for shade would huddle around fires, shivering. The cold brings its own problems: hypothermia, exhaustion, the stress of constant temperature extremes, wearing down the body, and the darkness. No light pollution in 525 BC. When the sun went down, the world became absolutely black except for the stars and the army's fires. Easy to get separated from your unit. Easy to wander off to relieve yourself and become hopelessly lost. Easy for the whole formation to drift off course without realizing it. Day after day of this. Week after week. The water getting lower. The rations getting tighter. The men getting weaker, sicker, more desperate. The animals dying. The supplies dwindling. The scouts gone. The guides uncertain. The officers trying to maintain discipline while privately wondering if they've made a terrible mistake. And somewhere ahead, how far? One more day. 3. A week. Somewhere ahead should be the next oasis. Must be the next oasis. Has to be. Because if it's not, if they've gone off course, if the oasis is dry, if they've somehow missed it entirely, then 50,000 men are going to die in the sand. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what happened. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. We're not ready yet to explore what killed them. First, we need to understand that they really are gone. That this isn't just a story or a legend. That somewhere in the western desert, an entire army vanished from history. Chapter 4. Herodotus' chilling account. So how do we know any of this happened? How do we know about an army that disappeared without survivors, without witnesses, without anyone to tell the tale? The answer lies with a man who lived nearly a century after these events. A man who traveled widely, collecting stories and trying to understand the world. A man who would become known as the father of history. Herodotus. Born around 484 BCE in Halicarnassus, modern-day Bodrum in Turkey. Herodotus spent much of his life traveling throughout the Mediterranean world, gathering accounts of wars, customs, peoples, and legends. He visited Egypt, probably sometime in the 450s or 440s BCE, when the events of Cambyses' expedition were still within living memory, just barely. By the time Herodotus was writing his histories around 430 BCE, about 95 years had passed since the army disappeared. Not ancient history by our standards, but far enough back that direct witnesses would be rare or gone. Herodotus would have been working with second-hand accounts, third-hand stories, temple records, and the collective memory of the Egyptian priests and people. And what he heard about Cambyses' lost army clearly fascinated him. In the third book of his histories, Herodotus tells the story with the confidence of someone reporting established facts, but also with the awareness that he's describing something extraordinary, something that defied normal explanation. Let's walk through his account, slowly, carefully, because this is essentially the only ancient source we have for what happened. Everything else, every theory, every search, every speculation, ultimately comes back to these words written 24 centuries ago. Herodotus tells us that Cambyses, having conquered Egypt, decided to launch 3 military expeditions to consolidate and expand Persian power in the region. One army would march south against the Ethiopians, another would attack Carthage in North Africa, and the third, our army, would go west to destroy the oracle of Ammonius at Siwa. The force destined for Siwa assembled at Thebes. Herodotus doesn't give us exact numbers. Ancient historians rarely bothered with precise figures, but other sources suggest around 50,000 men, a huge force by any standard. They marched west into the desert. Herodotus says they reached the city of Oasis, probably El-Kirgah, the first major watering point about 7 days' march from Thebes. This matches what we know about desert routes in that region. The army would have arrived tired but intact, their water supplies depleted, but not dangerously so. They rested at the oasis, refilled their water skins, let the pack animals drink and recover. So far, so good. The expedition was proceeding exactly as planned. Then, Herodotus tells us, the army left this oasis and marched onward toward Siwa. They were heading into the deep desert now, into territory where the oases were fewer, the distances greater, the margin for error razor-thin. And then something happened, something catastrophic, according to Herodotus. And here we need to pay very careful attention to his words. The army was somewhere in the middle of the desert, roughly halfway between the oasis they had left and their destination, when disaster struck. They were eating their morning meal. Just imagine that scene for a moment. 50,000 men at rest, perhaps in formation, perhaps scattered across the sand in military camps. Officers consulting with guides about the day's march. Soldiers eating their rations, dried meat, bread, dates, whatever provisions they carried. Pack animals being loaded, weapons and equipment being checked. The normal routine of an army on campaign. The sun rising over the desert, promising another day of brutal heat. And then the wind began to blow. At first, perhaps, it was nothing unusual. Wind is constant in the desert. It shifts the sand, creates strange sounds, but it's part of the environment. The men probably barely noticed it. But this wind didn't stop. It didn't fade. It grew. Stronger. Louder. Faster. Herodotus describes it as a wind from the south. A fierce, relentless wind that picked up the sand and hurled it through the air with growing violence. A sandstorm. If you've never experienced a desert sandstorm, it's difficult to convey just how terrifying they are. We think of storms as rain, thunder, lightning, water falling from the sky. A sandstorm is different. It's the earth itself rising up and attacking you. The wind reaches speeds of 50, 60, 70 miles per hour. It picks up millions of tons of sand and dust and flings it horizontally across the landscape. Visibility drops to zero. Not dark like night, but a choking, swirling, reddish-brown chaos where you can't see your hand in front of your face. The sand gets everywhere. In your eyes, blinding you. In your nose and mouth and lungs, choking you. The fine particles work into every gap in your clothing, scouring your skin like sandpaper. If you try to breathe, you inhale sand. If you open your eyes, you're instantly blinded by the stinging, scraping assault. The sound is overwhelming. A roar like standing next to a waterfall, but different, drier, angrier, more malevolent. It drowns out voices, makes communication impossible. You can't hear orders. You can't hear your fellow soldiers calling for help. And the sand moves, not just through the air, but along the ground. Dunes shift and collapse. Solid ground becomes quicksand as the wind undermines the surface. What was a flat camping area can become a sea of flowing sand in minutes. According to Herodotus, this is what struck the army of Cambyses. A massive sandstorm, roaring out of the south with biblical fury. The men would have tried to take shelter, but where? The desert offers no protection. No rocks to hide behind, no buildings to shelter in, no caves to wait out the storm. Just sand and more sand, all of it now weaponized by the wind. Perhaps they tried to form up, to maintain unit cohesion. Perhaps officers shouted orders that no one could hear. Perhaps the men simply scattered, each trying to survive as best he could. Some might have tried to cover their faces with cloth, to create makeshift protection against the stinging assault. Others might have tried to lie flat, to get below the worst of the wind. The pack animals would have panicked, horses screaming, camels bolting, donkeys collapsing under the stress. And still the storm raged. Minutes passed. Hours. Herodotus doesn't tell us how long it lasted, probably because no one who survived knew. Time loses meaning in that kind of chaos. It could have been an hour. It could have been a full day and night. But the worst part, according to Herodotus, wasn't just the wind and the sand in the air. The worst part was what the storm did to the landscape itself. The wind didn't just blow sand around. It moved it, transported it, redistributed it across the desert in massive quantities. Dunes collapsed in one place and built up in another. The sand that had been level ground became hills. The hills became valleys. The entire topography of the desert shifted and transformed under the storm's assault. And the army, 50,000 men, with their equipment and animals and supplies, the army was caught in the middle of it. Herodotus says they were buried alive, not killed by the wind or the sand in the air, though surely some died that way, suffocating on dust or being battered by debris, but buried, covered over, entombed by the moving dunes as the storm reshaped the desert. Imagine being that soldier, the wind howling around you, the sand piling up at your feet, then at your knees, then at your waist. You try to move, but the sand is too heavy, too deep. You try to climb out, but for every step up, you sink 2 steps down. The sand keeps coming, relentless, implacable. It covers your chest, your shoulders, your neck. You're still alive, still conscious, but you can't move, can't escape. The sand presses down on you with impossible weight. You struggle to breathe, but each breath brings more sand into your lungs. And then the sand covers your face. And then there is nothing. 50,000 men. 50,000 individual human beings, each with a name, a family, a life, dreams and fears and memories. Persians and Egyptians, and perhaps others, soldiers from across the empire, elite warriors and common infantry, officers who had commanded armies, and young men on their first campaign. All of them, according to Herodotus, buried beneath the sand in a matter of hours. No one survived to tell the tale. No scouts made it back to Thebes. No stragglers limped into some distant oasis with news of the disaster. The entire force, every single man, every animal, every piece of equipment, vanished as completely as if they had never existed. The storm eventually passed, as storms do. The wind died down. The sand settled. The desert returned to its usual terrible calm. And somewhere beneath that sand lay an entire army. Or so Herodotus says. Back in Egypt, days passed. Then weeks. The army should have reached Siwa by now. Should have destroyed the oracle. Should have sent word of victory. Should have begun the return journey. But no word came. Months passed. Still nothing. Eventually, the truth became unavoidable. The army wasn't delayed. Wasn't lost in the sense of unable to find their way. Wasn't besieged or captured or defeated in battle. The army was simply gone. Cambyses, assuming he was still alive when the news reached him, the timeline is unclear, would have had no explanation. No bodies to recover. No prisoners to ransom. No enemy to blame or punish. Just an absence where an army used to be. The oracle of Ammonius, untouched in its desert sanctuary, continued to prophesy. The priests of Siwa probably heard the news, with a mixture of relief and superstitious awe. The god had been challenged. The god had responded, not with lightning or angels or divine warriors, but with wind and sand and silence. This is the story Herodotus tells us. This is the account that has come down through 24 centuries. A story so dramatic, so catastrophic, so complete in its destruction that it hardly seems real. And that's the problem, isn't it? It hardly seems real. Which raises an obvious question. A question we'll need to explore carefully, without prejudice or predetermined conclusions. Is it real? Did it actually happen the way Herodotus describes? Or is this a legend, a myth, a cautionary tale about the dangers of hubris dressed up as history? To answer that, we need to look at what else might have happened. We need to consider the alternatives. We need to examine the evidence, or the lack of it. But that's a journey for the next part of our story. For now, rest here for a moment. Let the image settle in your mind. An army buried in sand. 50,000 lives ended in a single catastrophic event. Whether it's true or not, it's a powerful story. A reminder of how small we are against the forces of nature. How quickly certainty can turn to disaster. How the desert gives nothing and takes everything. The wind blows. The sand shifts. And empires fade into dust. Chapter 5. A desert capable of erasing armies. Before we decide whether Herodotus' account is plausible, we need to understand something fundamental about the western desert of Egypt. We need to understand that this isn't just an inhospitable place. It's a landscape that operates by rules so different from normal human experience that what sounds impossible elsewhere might be perfectly reasonable there. The western desert is part of the Greater Sahara, the largest hot desert in the world, stretching across North Africa from the Atlantic Ocean to the Red Sea. But within that vast expanse, certain regions stand out as particularly extreme, particularly hostile to human life. One of those regions is called the Great Sand Sea. The Great Sand Sea. Even the name sounds mythical, doesn't it? But it's a real place, a real geographical feature, and it covers an area of about 72,000 square kilometers, roughly the size of Ireland or South Carolina. It lies between Egypt and Libya, a vast ocean of sand dunes that can reach heights of over 100 meters, more than 300 feet tall. These aren't the gentle, rolling dunes you might see in movies or photographs. These are massive geological structures, sand mountains that dwarf human scale. Some of them are star dunes, multi-arm formations where several dune ridges meet at a central peak. Others are linear dunes, knife-edge ridges that can run for dozens of miles in parallel lines, like enormous furrows plowed by some Titan farmer. And they move. We mentioned this before, but it's worth emphasizing. Desert dunes are not static. They're mobile features, constantly shifting under the influence of wind. The prevailing winds in this region come from the north and northeast, pushing sand steadily southward. But there are also the Cambyses winds, violent southerly winds that can reverse the normal pattern and push sand northward with tremendous force. Cambyses. The word comes from Arabic meaning 50, because these winds traditionally blow for about 50 days between March and May. But that's an average. In any given year, Cambyses storms can be more frequent, more intense, more sustained than usual. And when a Cambyses wind blows in the Great Sand Sea, it doesn't just ruffle the surface. It transforms the landscape. Modern measurements have recorded Cambyses winds exceeding 100 miles per hour. At those speeds, sand doesn't just blow, it flows like water. Dunes collapse and reform. Level ground becomes mountainous. Valleys fill in. The entire topography can change beyond recognition in a matter of hours. Objects left on the surface, vehicles, equipment, buildings, anything not firmly anchored, can be buried under several meters of sand in a single storm. There are documented cases from the 20th century of military vehicles, weather stations, even small settlements being completely covered by sand in Cambyses storms, lost until excavation teams could dig them out. Now imagine 50,000 men caught in such a storm with no protection, no shelter, no modern equipment, no radios to call for help, no weather satellites to warn them, no rescue helicopters to evacuate them. Just men, cloth, leather, bronze, and the naked power of the desert. Herodotus' account suddenly seems less like legend and more like a plausible description of a natural disaster. But let's dig deeper. Let's look at what modern science can tell us about the conditions in the 6th century BCE, around the time Cambyses' army would have been marching through the desert. Paleoclimatology, the study of ancient climates, has given us remarkable insights into historical weather patterns. Scientists can analyze tree rings, ice cores, sediment layers, and other natural records to reconstruct what the climate was like thousands of years ago. And what they've found about the 520s BCE is fascinating and troubling. There's evidence of significant climate instability during this period. Not a complete climate shift, but a period of more extreme weather patterns, more variable precipitation, more intense storms. Some researchers have linked this to volcanic activity. Major eruptions can pump enough particles into the atmosphere to affect weather patterns for years afterward. In the Mediterranean and North African regions during the early 6th century BCE, there are indicators of increased storminess, more dramatic temperature swings, and generally more chaotic weather than the periods immediately before or after. This doesn't prove that a catastrophic sandstorm hit Cambyses' army, but it does establish that the climate conditions of the time were conducive to extreme weather events. The kind of once-in-a-generation storm that could bury an army wasn't just possible. It was more likely during this period than during more stable climatic phases. But here's something else to consider. Something that doesn't require a dramatic sandstorm at all. Water scarcity. Let's return to the basic mathematics of desert survival. 50,000 men. Each man needs several gallons of water per day in extreme heat. That's hundreds of thousands of gallons per day for the entire force. The army was marching from oasis to oasis, each stage of the journey carefully planned to ensure they would reach water before their supplies ran out. But what if something went wrong with that plan? What if the guides miscalculated the distance? What if an oasis they were counting on had dried up? A not uncommon occurrence in the desert, where underground water sources can shift or fail. What if they simply got lost? Easier than you might think in a landscape of shifting sand where landmarks disappear. If the army missed an oasis, or reached one that was dry, they would face a simple but catastrophic problem. They could try to ration the remaining water and push on to the next oasis, gambling that they could reach it before the water ran out completely. Or they could try to backtrack to the last known water source, a retreat that would also require water they might not have. Either way, if they got it wrong, the result would be the same. Mass death from dehydration. Not a quick death, either. Dehydration in the desert is a horrible way to die. The first stage is uncomfortable. Extreme thirst, dry mouth, reduced urination. The second stage brings weakness, dizziness, confusion. The third stage is where things get truly horrific. Delirium, seizures. The body essentially shutting down as cells throughout the body fail from lack of water. At advanced stages, men would become irrational, violent even. Military discipline would break down as soldiers fought over the remaining water. Some would wander off into the desert, hallucinating, chasing mirages. Others would simply collapse where they stood and never rise again. The strong might survive a day or two longer than the weak, but in the end, without water, everyone dies. Every single person. And here's the grimness of it. The bodies would be preserved by the extreme dryness, mummified naturally by the desert conditions. Then, as wind and sand covered them over the following days, weeks, and months, they would be buried in the same dunes that killed them. No dramatic storm necessary, just mathematics, geography, and the remorseless physics of human hydration. This scenario, death by water scarcity, could account for the complete disappearance of the army just as effectively as Herodotus' sandstorm, perhaps more effectively, because it requires no unusual weather. Just a normal failure of logistics in an abnormally hostile environment. And consider this. The two scenarios aren't mutually exclusive. Perhaps the army did face water shortages. Perhaps they were already weakened, desperate, disorganized when the storm hit. Perhaps men who might have survived a sandstorm with proper preparation and cohesion instead died because they were already on the edge of death from thirst. The desert is capable of killing in many ways. It doesn't need to choose just one. There's another factor worth considering, something that makes the western desert particularly dangerous for large formations like armies. The desert penalizes scale. A single traveler, or a small group, can move quickly, carry sufficient water for themselves, take shelter in small spaces, make decisions rapidly. A caravan of traders might include dozens of camels and people, but they're organized for desert travel, experienced, equipped appropriately. But an army of 50,000? That's a different proposition entirely. Such a large force can't move quickly. It takes hours just to break camp and get everyone moving. The column would stretch for miles, making communication between front and rear difficult or impossible. If the front of the column encounters a problem, a collapsed dune blocking the path, a dried-up oasis, it takes time for that information to reach the rear, and more time to adjust the plan. Large forces need large amounts of everything: water, food, space to camp. They can't fit into small oases or take shelter in modest rocky outcrops. They're visible from great distances, unable to hide or take evasive action. They move at the speed of their slowest elements: the heavily loaded pack animals, the exhausted stragglers, the sick and injured. In normal warfare, size is strength. In the desert, size is vulnerability. The desert rewards the small, the mobile, the adaptable. It punishes the large, the slow, the rigid. An army, especially an ancient army used to more forgiving terrain, is almost perfectly designed to fail in the Great Sand Sea. Modern militaries understand this. Even with all our technology, GPS, helicopters, air-conditioned vehicles, instant communication, operating large forces in extreme deserts is recognized as one of the most challenging military operations possible. Special training is required, special equipment, detailed planning, and even then, things can go catastrophically wrong. The Persian army of 525 BCE had none of those advantages. They had Bronze Age technology, ancient logistics, limited maps, and no real understanding of the specific challenges they would face. They were walking into an environment that had killed countless travelers before them and would kill countless more after them. The Western Desert doesn't care about your empire. It doesn't care about your army's reputation or your king's ambitions. It certainly doesn't care about your divine right to rule. The desert has one rule, and only one rule: bring enough water or die. Cambyses' army, whether through misfortune, miscalculation, or malevolent weather, apparently failed to follow that rule. And the desert, indifferent and implacable as always, collected its due. So we have plausibility. The Western Desert is certainly capable of destroying an army. The climate conditions of the time made extreme events more likely. The logistical challenges of moving 50,000 men through that landscape were immense. Death by sandstorm, death by thirst, death by getting lost. All of these are well within the realm of possibility. But possibility isn't the same as proof. The question isn't whether the desert could have destroyed the army. The question is, did it? And if it did, where are they? Where are the bodies? The equipment? The evidence? 50,000 men don't just disappear without leaving any trace at all, do they? That's what we need to explore next. The search for evidence. The expeditions, the discoveries, the theories. The modern attempts to solve an ancient mystery. Because if the army is really out there, buried somewhere in the sand, shouldn't we have found them by now? Chapter 6. Silence from the Victors. Here's where our story takes an interesting turn. Because if 50,000 Persian soldiers really did vanish in the desert, if one of the greatest military disasters in ancient history really occurred, we should expect to find some record of it beyond Herodotus' account. The Persians kept records. They were an administrative empire, bureaucratic by the standards of their time. They carved monuments, wrote on clay tablets, maintained archives. They documented their victories extensively. Surely, they would have documented this catastrophe as well. Except they didn't. Or if they did, those records haven't survived. Or perhaps, and this is where things get intriguing, they chose not to document it at all. Let's start with the official Persian records that we do have. After Cambyses died in 522 BCE, only 3 years after the army's disappearance, and under mysterious circumstances that we'll set aside for now, power eventually passed to Darius I, known to history as Darius the Great. He would rule for 36 years, from 522 to 486 BCE, presiding over the Persian Empire at its absolute zenith. Darius was a king who understood the power of propaganda. He commissioned one of the most remarkable monuments of the ancient world, the Behistun inscription, a massive carved text on a cliff face in western Iran. It's written in 3 languages, Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, and it tells the story of Darius' rise to power, his victories, his legitimacy as king. The Behistun inscription is incredibly detailed. It lists rebellions he crushed, battles he won, territories he controlled. It's a comprehensive catalog of triumph, designed to proclaim to anyone who could read it, and even to those who couldn't, just by its sheer monumental presence, that Darius was the rightful king of kings, chosen by Ahura Mazda, victorious over all enemies. And it doesn't mention the Lost Army. Not once. You might think this is an oversight. Maybe the disaster happened under Cambyses, so Darius didn't feel the need to address it. Maybe it simply wasn't relevant to the narrative he was trying to create. But here's the thing. The inscription talks at length about Cambyses. It establishes the legitimacy of Cambyses' rule as Cyrus' successor. It describes the transition of power. It references events from Cambyses' reign. But it says nothing about the loss of 50,000 men in Egypt. The silence is conspicuous, almost deliberate. Other Persian royal inscriptions follow the same pattern. They boast of victories. They catalog territories. They list the peoples and nations under Persian rule. They describe military campaigns in detail, numbers of enemies killed, cities captured, wealth seized. But nowhere in the surviving Persian records is there any clear mention of an entire army disappearing in the western desert. This absence is strange enough that historians have debated its meaning for centuries. Is it evidence that the disaster never happened? That Herodotus' account is just a legend? Or is it evidence of something else entirely? A cover-up, a deliberate suppression of embarrassing information? Think about it from the Persian perspective. You're running an empire that depends on the perception of invincibility. Your power rests not just on actual military strength, but on the belief, held by both subjects and potential enemies, that resistance is futile, that the Persian army cannot be stopped. Then you lose 50,000 men, not in glorious battle, not defeated by a worthy enemy, just lost, swallowed by the desert, gone. How do you spin that? How do you incorporate that into your narrative of inevitable triumph? You can't really. It's not a defeat you can avenge. There's no enemy to conquer in retaliation. There's no lesson about Persian valor or military skill. It's just embarrassment, a massive, expensive, humiliating failure that serves no propaganda purpose whatsoever. So perhaps the choice was made, at the highest levels, to simply not talk about it, to let the disaster fade into obscurity, to focus on victories that could be celebrated rather than losses that had to be explained. In an age before mass media, before widespread literacy, before historical records were broadly distributed, this was possible. Most people in the Persian Empire would never have heard about the disaster in the first place. Those who did hear about it, through rumor, through Egyptian sources, could be dismissed as spreading enemy propaganda. And if you simply never mention it in official records, never acknowledge it in royal inscriptions, never allow it to become part of the empire's historical narrative, then for all practical purposes, it didn't happen. Or at least, it didn't happen in a way that matters to the empire's self-image. This might sound cynical, but it's very much in line with how ancient empires handled embarrassing events. The Romans did the same thing with certain defeats. The Chinese dynasties carefully curated their historical records to maintain face. The Egyptians often erased the names and monuments of pharaohs they wanted to forget. Memory in the ancient world was selective by design. But there's another perspective to consider, one that comes from the other side of this conflict. The Egyptians. The Egyptians had every reason to celebrate the destruction of a Persian army. They had been conquered, humiliated, occupied by foreign forces. Their pharaohs had been overthrown. Their sovereignty had been stripped away. If an entire Persian army had been destroyed attempting to attack one of Egypt's most sacred oracles, that would be propaganda gold. The gods of Egypt striking down the arrogant foreigners. Divine justice delivered through the power of the desert. The oracle of Ammonius proving its sanctity by destroying those who would defile it. This is exactly the kind of story that should have been celebrated in temples, recorded in hieroglyphics, passed down through generations as proof that the Egyptian gods still protected their land even under foreign occupation. And yet, the Egyptian records are almost as quiet as the Persian ones. There are Egyptian sources that mention Cambyses, and they're uniformly hostile. Egyptian tradition remembers him as a madman, a tyrant, a blasphemer who violated their sacred customs. Some accounts claim he killed the sacred Apis bull, a living god in Egyptian religion, an act of unthinkable sacrilege. Whether these accounts are true or propaganda is debatable. But what's notable is that they focus on religious offenses, on violations of sacred tradition. They paint Cambyses as an enemy of the gods. Yet they don't clearly describe the destruction of his army as divine punishment. There are vague references, hints, suggestions that might be interpreted as alluding to the Lost Army. But nothing as explicit or triumphant as you would expect if the Egyptians had definitive knowledge of such a spectacular disaster. Why not? Perhaps because the information itself was uncertain. Remember, there were no survivors to tell the tale. No one who marched with the army ever came back. So what did the Egyptians actually know? They knew an army marched west from Thebes. They knew it never reached Siwa. They knew it never returned. But did they know how it was destroyed? Did they know where it happened? Did they have any details beyond it disappeared? If the information was vague, if the details were murky, then perhaps the Egyptian priests and scribes hesitated to make grand claims they couldn't substantiate. Or perhaps they did make such claims, but those particular texts haven't survived to the present day. Alternatively, and this is a darker possibility, perhaps the silence on the Egyptian side isn't about uncertainty. Perhaps it's about fear. Remember, Egypt was under Persian occupation when this happened. Cambyses was still alive, still ruling Egypt as pharaoh. However much the Egyptians resented that claim, open celebration of a Persian military disaster might be seen as rebellion, the kind of thing that gets temples closed and priests executed. Even after Cambyses died, Persia continued to control Egypt for more than a century. Open mockery of Persian failures in official records might not have been wise. The Egyptians could nurture their resentment privately, pass down oral traditions about Persian incompetence and divine justice, but putting it in permanent public records? That might be asking for trouble. So we have this strange situation. A massive military disaster, one of the most catastrophic losses of life in ancient warfare, and both sides seem reluctant to discuss it in their official records. The Persians because it's embarrassing, the Egyptians because they're occupied and perhaps uncertain of the details. And in that silence, in that gap in the historical record, legends grow. Stories get embellished. Details get added or lost. The truth, whatever it was, becomes harder to discern as the years pass and memory fades. By the time Herodotus is traveling through Egypt, nearly a century after the event, what would he have found? Persian official records that don't mention it. Egyptian oral traditions that might contradict each other. Temple priests with their own versions of the story, perhaps exaggerated for effect. Locals who heard it from someone who heard it from someone else. Herodotus, to his credit, seems to have been aware of these issues. He often notes when he's skeptical of information, when different sources contradict each other, when something seems too incredible to fully believe. He presents himself as a careful compiler of accounts rather than an omniscient narrator. But he's still working with sources that are, at best, second or third hand. And he's working within a tradition, ancient historical writing, that didn't always distinguish clearly between what we would call history and what we would call legend. The silence from official sources, then, is both a problem and a clue. It's a problem because it means we can't corroborate Herodotus' account with contemporary documentation. We can't check his version of events against Persian or Egyptian official records because those records don't seem to exist. Or if they did exist, they haven't survived. But it's also a clue because the pattern of silence itself suggests something significant happened. If the entire story were pure fiction, pure legend with no basis in reality, you might expect Egyptian sources to explicitly deny it, or Persian sources to address and refute the rumors. Instead, we get nothing. An empty space where we would expect commentary. And sometimes, what's not said can be as revealing as what is said. The silence feels deliberate, like a collective decision to let this particular disaster fade into obscurity, to move on, to focus on more palatable narratives. But history has a way of refusing to stay buried. Stories persist, questions linger, and eventually, people start looking for answers. Which brings us to the modern era, to the archaeologists and explorers who heard the ancient story and decided to do what neither the Persians nor the Egyptians apparently chose to do. Go into the desert and find out what really happened. Because if the army is out there, if the bodies and equipment and evidence exist somewhere beneath the sand, then perhaps, with modern technology and scientific methods, we can finally uncover the truth that ancient empires chose to bury. The search for the lost army is about to begin. Chapter 7. Another possibility, not buried, but defeated. Before we venture into the desert with modern explorers searching for buried remains, we need to pause and consider something important, something that challenges the entire narrative we've been building. What if there's no army to find? Not because it never existed, not because the story is pure legend, but because we've been looking for the wrong thing in the wrong way. What if the army wasn't buried by a sandstorm at all? What if it was destroyed by something far more mundane, far more human, and far more embarrassing to the Persian Empire? What if it was simply defeated? This is the radical proposal put forward by Olaf Kapper, a Dutch Egyptologist who has spent years studying the Persian occupation of Egypt. And his theory, backed by archaeological evidence and careful analysis of temple inscriptions, suggests that the mystery of the lost army might not be a mystery of nature at all. It might be a mystery of politics, warfare, and historical cover-up. Let's explore this possibility carefully, because if Kapper is right, it changes everything about how we understand this story. The standard narrative, the one we've been following, assumes that the army marched peacefully through the oases until disaster struck somewhere in the deep desert. Persian force meets natural catastrophe. Empire versus nature. Hubris punished by the gods or by random chance. It's a dramatic story. A clean story. A story that fits our expectations about ancient history and the dangers of the desert. But Kapper asks us to remember something crucial. Egypt in 525 BCE wasn't a peaceful province, happily accepting Persian rule. It was occupied territory, conquered, but not pacified, resentful, angry, and in some areas, actively resistant. The Persian conquest had been swift and brutal. The old Egyptian pharaoh Psamtik III had been defeated, captured, and eventually executed. The ancient kingdom that had stood for 3,000 years had been reduced to just another Persian province in a matter of months. But military conquest doesn't equal political acceptance, and it certainly doesn't guarantee stability. In the years immediately following the conquest, there were uprisings. Local leaders who refused to accept Persian authority. Priests who maintained that the Persian king had no legitimate claim to the title of pharaoh. Populations that saw the occupiers as foreign invaders, not rightful rulers. And one of those rebel leaders was a man named Pechebastus III. Pechebastus claimed to be pharaoh, the rightful pharaoh, the true heir to Egypt's ancient throne. He wasn't recognized by the Persians, obviously. In Persian records and in later Egyptian dynastic lists, he doesn't appear. He's a ghost, an absence, a name that exists only in fragmentary references and inscriptions that the official histories tried to erase. But he was real. And according to Kapper's research, he was dangerous. Pechebastus III appears to have controlled, or at least influenced, territory in the western desert, specifically the area around Dakhla Oasis, one of the major oases that the Persian army would have needed to pass through on their route to Siwa. Dakhla Oasis, a substantial settlement in the middle of the desert, surrounded by hundreds of miles of sand in every direction, a place with water, date palms, agricultural land, and a local population that had reason to hate the Persian invaders. And according to Kapper, Pechebastus had turned it into something else, a military stronghold. The evidence comes from archaeological work at a site called Amhida, within the Dakhla Oasis region. Excavations there have uncovered temple inscriptions that date to exactly this period, the late 520s BC. And these inscriptions reveal something fascinating. They describe military preparations, fortifications, a rebel pharaoh rallying support, and building an armed resistance. Now, imagine you're Cambyses, planning your expedition to Siwa. You know you need to pass through the oases on the way. You probably assume, because why wouldn't you, that these oases are under your control. They're part of Egypt. Egypt is part of your empire. Therefore, the oases should welcome your army, provide supplies, and send you on your way. But what if Dakhla wasn't under Persian control? What if it was held by rebels loyal to Pechebastus? What if the Persian army, expecting a friendly stopover, instead marched into an ambush. Consider the tactical situation. 50,000 men, strung out in a long column, exhausted from desert marching, desperate for water. They arrive at Dakhla expecting rest and resupply. Instead, they find a hostile force waiting for them. The oasis is fortified. The wells are controlled by the enemy. The surrounding desert offers no escape routes, not for an army that size, not without water. It would be a slaughter, not a battle in the traditional sense, not two armies meeting on an open field with honor and glory, but an ambush, a siege, a slow destruction of a force that can't retreat, can't advance, and can't survive without the water that's being denied to them. Some soldiers might fight. Others might try to surrender. Many would simply die of thirst and exhaustion, sprawled around an oasis they can see but can't reach. Egyptian rebels rather than die for an empire that had sent them into a trap. And here's where Capper's theory gets really interesting. He suggests that the army wasn't completely destroyed in the sense of every man killed. Some might have survived. Some might have been captured. Some might have defected, choosing to join the Egyptian rebels rather than die for an empire that had sent them into a trap. In ancient warfare, this wasn't uncommon. Soldiers were often more loyal to their immediate commanders, or to their own survival, than to distant kings. If offered a choice between death in the desert and integration into the local population, many would choose integration. These survivors, if they existed, would have dispersed. Some might have settled in the oases, marrying local women, adopting local customs, gradually becoming Egyptian rather than Persian. Others might have fled to other parts of Egypt, keeping their heads down, never revealing their past. Within a generation, their origins would be forgotten. Within 2 generations, their descendants would be indistinguishable from the rest of the population. An entire army, absorbed into Egypt rather than buried beneath it, and the historical record would show nothing. No survivors returning to Thebes with tales of defeat. No mass grave to be discovered. No battlefield archaeology. Just an army that marched into the desert and never came back. From the Persian perspective, this would be infinitely more embarrassing than a natural disaster. A sandstorm is bad luck. An ambush by rebels you thought were pacified is incompetence. It raises questions about the security of your new province, the loyalty of your subjects, the effectiveness of your intelligence and military planning. Much better to let people think it was a sandstorm. Much better to let nature take the blame rather than admit you were outmaneuvered by local rebels. And from the Egyptian perspective, well, Petrobastis was ultimately unsuccessful. The rebellion failed. The Persians maintained control of Egypt. Celebrating the destruction of one army might draw attention to a rebel pharaoh that the Persians wanted erased from history. Better to keep quiet, let the story become vague and mythological, and avoid Persian retaliation. So both sides, for different reasons, have motivation to obscure what really happened. The evidence Capper presents is circumstantial but compelling. Temple inscriptions at Amhida that reference military activity during the right time period. Archaeological evidence of fortifications at Dakhla. The timeline matching the disappearance of the army. The political context of Egyptian resistance to Persian rule. It's not proof. Not the kind of definitive archaeological discovery that would close the case. But it's a coherent alternative explanation that accounts for many of the puzzling aspects of the story. Why no bodies have been found? Because they weren't buried in a single location. They were scattered across the oasis region, or carried away, or absorbed into the local population. Why the Persian records are silent? Because a military defeat by rebels is more embarrassing than a natural disaster. Why the Egyptian records are vague? Because openly celebrating would draw attention to a rebellion that ultimately failed. Why Herodotus heard about a sandstorm? Because that's the version of the story that both sides found acceptable. Persians because it wasn't their fault, Egyptians because it still represented divine justice, without explicitly mentioning embarrassing rebels. It's elegant. It fits the evidence. It explains the historical silences. But here's the problem with Capper's theory, and he would probably acknowledge this himself. It's very difficult to prove. How do you find evidence of an army that dispersed rather than died in one place? How do you identify the descendants of Persian soldiers who integrated into Egyptian society 25 centuries ago? How do you distinguish between normal military activity at an oasis and specific evidence of the ambush that destroyed Cambyses' army? You can build a compelling case from the available evidence. You can show that it's plausible, even probable. But you can't point to a mass grave and say, there, that's them. That's the Lost Army. Which brings us to an interesting place philosophically. We have two main theories. The sandstorm theory, supported by Herodotus, consistent with our understanding of desert weather, dramatic and cinematically appealing, but lacking physical evidence. The ambush theory, supported by archaeological finds at Dakhla, consistent with the political situation, explains the historical silences, but also lacking definitive proof. Both are plausible. Both fit some of the evidence. Neither can be definitively proven with what we currently know. And perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps the mystery of the Lost Army is destined to remain partially unsolved, suspended between natural disaster and human conflict, between the power of nature and the power of politics. Or perhaps, and this is what drives archaeologists and explorers to keep searching, perhaps there's still evidence out there, waiting to be discovered. Evidence that will finally tell us whether 50,000 men were buried by sand or defeated by swords. The desert keeps its secrets well, but it doesn't keep them forever. Modern technology, modern methods, modern determination, these might yet uncover what ancient empires chose to hide. So let's turn our attention to those who have searched, those who have ventured into the western desert with the tools of archaeology and the dream of solving one of history's great mysteries. Let's explore the modern hunt for the Lost Army of Cambyses. Chapter 8. Searching for the Lost Army. The 20th century brought something new to the mystery of the Lost Army, the possibility of actually finding it. For 2,000 years, the story had been just that, a story. Something to debate in libraries, to speculate about in academic papers, to retell around campfires. The desert was too vast, too dangerous, too unknown. Even if the army was out there somewhere, buried beneath the sand, how would you ever find it? But the 20th century brought new tools, new technologies, new methods of exploration, and more importantly, new kinds of people, adventurers and archaeologists who heard the old story and thought, why not try? The search for Cambyses' lost army became one of those romantic archaeological quests that captures the imagination, like the search for Troy, or for Atlantis, or for the tomb of Alexander the Great, a mystery that combines history, legend, and the promise of spectacular discovery. And so they came, explorer after explorer, expedition after expedition, venturing into the western desert with varying degrees of preparation, expertise, and luck. The searches began in earnest in the 1930s. Early explorers worked with the technology available at the time, which is to say, not much by our standards. Compasses, maps of questionable accuracy, vehicles that were barely adequate for desert travel. They would drive or ride camels through the most likely areas, eyes scanning the sand for any sign of ancient artifacts. Some were serious archaeologists. Others were adventurers, with more enthusiasm than methodology. Some were treasure hunters looking for the gold and valuables that surely an army of 50,000 would have carried. And occasionally, they found things. Bronze artifacts, weapons, fragments of pottery, human remains. Each discovery sparked excitement. Could this be it? Could this be evidence of a lost army? But again and again, the excitement faded. The artifacts would be dated, through stylistic analysis, through associated pottery, through whatever methods were available, and they would turn out to be from the wrong period. Bronze Age. Centuries, sometimes more than a millennium. Too old to be from Cambyses' expedition. Evidence of earlier travelers, earlier armies, earlier civilizations that had also ventured into the desert and also, sometimes, died there. The desert, it turned out, was full of archaeological remains, just not the specific remains everyone was looking for. This is one of the challenges of searching for the lost army. The western desert has been a corridor for human movement for thousands of years. Trade caravans, military expeditions, nomadic tribes. Each generation left its traces, and the sand, which preserves so well in the dry climate, has preserved evidence from many different periods all jumbled together. Finding ancient artifacts in the desert doesn't automatically mean you found Cambyses' army. You need to prove the date, the context, the connection to that specific historical event. And that's remarkably difficult when you're dealing with scattered finds in shifting sand with no clear archaeological stratigraphy. As technology improved, so did the searches. By the latter half of the 20th century, explorers had access to metal detectors, ground-penetrating radar, aerial photography, and eventually satellite imagery. Tools that could see beneath the surface, that could survey vast areas, that could identify anomalies that might indicate buried structures or mass graves. The Egyptian government, recognizing both the archaeological importance and the tourism potential, began to support and regulate expeditions. Professional archaeologists with modern training and methods joined the search. The quest became more scientific, more systematic, more rigorous. And still, nothing definitive turned up. Oh, there were finds. Interesting finds. Important finds, from an archaeological perspective. Evidence of ancient trade routes. Roman-era outposts. Prehistoric settlements. The Western Desert revealed itself to be far more populated, throughout history, than anyone had imagined. But the Lost Army remained lost. Then, in 2009, something happened that reignited global interest in the mystery. The Castiglione brothers, Angelo and Alfredo, Italian explorers and archaeologists who had spent years searching the desert, made an announcement that sent ripples through the archaeological community and captured headlines around the world. They claimed to have found evidence of the Lost Army. The location was in the desert between Siwa Oasis and the Egyptian-Libyan border, an area that fits, geographically, with the route the army would have taken. The Castigliones reported finding weapons, jewelry, and human remains scattered across the sand. Persian-era artifacts, evidence of a military presence, bones bleached by centuries of desert sun. The announcement sparked tremendous excitement. Finally, after decades of searching, after countless expeditions that came up empty-handed, here was tangible evidence. Here was proof that the story wasn't just legend. Newspapers ran with it. Documentary producers contacted the Castigliones. The discovery was presented as the solution to an ancient mystery, the vindication of Herodotus' account, the archaeological find of the decade. But then came the complications. The academic community, while intrigued, wanted more information. They wanted detailed reports. They wanted carbon dating of the remains. They wanted analysis of the artifacts. They wanted precise GPS coordinates so other researchers could verify the finds and conduct their own studies. And this is where the story becomes murky. The Castigliones were not forthcoming with all the details. The exact location was kept secret, ostensibly to prevent looting, a legitimate concern in archaeological work. But it also meant other researchers couldn't verify the finds independently. The artifacts themselves, the weapons, the jewelry, weren't made available for extensive study by other experts. Photographs and descriptions were provided, but the actual objects remained in the Castigliones' possession. The human remains, crucial evidence that could be dated through radiocarbon analysis or analyzed for DNA or dietary information, weren't subjected to the rigorous testing that modern archaeology demands. Questions began to multiply. Were these artifacts really from the Persian period? How could the Castigliones be certain? What was the archaeological context of the finds? Were they found together in a way that suggested a military disaster, or scattered across a wide area in a way that could indicate multiple different time periods? And perhaps most importantly, why the secrecy? Why not collaborate fully with academic institutions that could bring resources and expertise to verify and contextualize the discovery? The controversy didn't mean the Castigliones had fabricated anything. It didn't mean their finds were illegitimate. But it did mean that the archaeological community couldn't accept their claims at face value. Without proper verification, without peer review, without the ability to replicate and confirm the findings, the discovery remained in a kind of limbo. Provocative, interesting, possibly significant, but not proven. And so the mystery deepened rather than resolved. The 2009 announcement, which seemed at first to be the answer everyone was waiting for, instead became another chapter in the ongoing quest, a promising lead that couldn't quite cross the threshold from possibility to certainty. Meanwhile, other researchers were taking different approaches to the search. Satellite imagery had become increasingly sophisticated. High-resolution photographs from space could reveal subtle variations in the desert surface, ancient roads, buried structures, geological features that might indicate areas worth investigating on the ground. Teams of researchers began systematically analyzing satellite images of the Western Desert, looking for anomalies, for patterns, for anything that might indicate a major archaeological site. And they found caravan routes, ancient pathways crossing the desert, visible from space as slight discolorations or compressions in the sand. Evidence that confirmed what historians had long suspected. The Western Desert was crisscrossed with trade routes connecting the oases and linking Egypt with regions to the west. This was valuable information. It helped map the possible routes that Cambyses' army might have taken. It identified areas where archaeological investigation might be most productive. But it didn't reveal mass graves, didn't show concentrations of artifacts, didn't point to a specific location where 50,000 men might have perished. The satellite surveys were thorough, sophisticated, covering vast areas with remarkable detail. And yet they too came up without definitive evidence of the lost army. Which raises an interesting question. If the army is really out there, why haven't modern technologies found it? Several possibilities suggest themselves. First, the desert is simply enormous. Even with satellite imagery, even with systematic surveys, there are vast areas that haven't been thoroughly investigated on the ground. The Great Sand Sea alone covers tens of thousands of square kilometers. You could hide dozens of armies in that expanse. Second, if the army was buried by a sandstorm as Herodotus describes, the remains might be very deep. Ground-penetrating radar has limitations. It can detect anomalies a few meters down, but if the bodies and equipment are buried 10 meters deep, or 20, or 50, as they might be after 25 centuries of sand accumulation, they might be invisible to current technology. Third, and this returns to Capper's theory, perhaps there's no concentrated site to find. If the army was defeated and dispersed, if the remains were scattered across multiple locations, if survivors integrated into the local population, then you're not looking for a battlefield or a mass grave. You're looking for traces that might be indistinguishable from other historical evidence of human activity in the region. Fourth, it's possible, though painful to contemplate from an archaeological perspective, that the remains have already been found but weren't recognized as such. Early expeditions, lacking modern dating methods, might have encountered evidence of the army, but dismissed it as being from the wrong period. Artifacts might have been collected by looters or casual travelers and scattered into private collections where they can't be properly studied. The search continues. Even now, in the 21st century, archaeologists and explorers are still looking. New technologies, better radar, more sophisticated satellite imaging, drone surveys, AI-assisted analysis of aerial photographs offer new possibilities. But with each passing decade, the mystery seems not closer to solution, but somehow deeper, more complex, more resistant to easy answers. 50,000 men don't just vanish. And yet, apparently they can. They did. Whether they're buried in the sand, waiting to be discovered by some future expedition with better tools, whether they're scattered across the desert, their remains too dispersed to ever form a coherent archaeological site, whether they're resting in graves near Dakhla, misidentified or overlooked, or whether the story itself is somehow different from what we've been told, a legend that grew from a smaller disaster, or a cover story that hides a more complex truth. We still don't know. And perhaps that's what makes this story so enduring. Not the answer, but the question. Not the certainty of knowledge, but the tantalizing possibility of discovery. The Lost Army of Cambyses remains lost, but the search for them, the human desire to solve mysteries, to uncover the past, to understand what happened to those 50,000 men who walked into the desert and never returned, that search continues. And maybe one day someone will find them, or maybe the desert will keep its secret forever. Chapter 9, Why No Bodies? Let's address the elephant in the room, or rather, the absence of elephants in the room. If 50,000 men really died in the Western Desert 25 centuries ago, where are the bodies? This is the question skeptics always return to. It seems like simple logic. 50,000 people means 50,000 skeletons. That's an enormous amount of physical evidence. Bones, armor, weapons, equipment, personal belongings. Even accounting for decay and deterioration, surely something should remain. Surely we should have found at least some trace by now. The fact that we haven't, or at least, that we haven't found anything we can definitively connect to Cambyses' army, is often cited as evidence that the story is exaggerated or entirely fictional. But the relationship between death in the desert and archaeological evidence is more complicated than it might seem. To understand why the bodies might not have been found, we need to think carefully about what happens to human remains in desert conditions over very long periods of time. Let's start with preservation. The western desert is hyper-arid, extremely dry, with almost no rainfall. In theory, this is excellent for preservation. Organic materials that would rot quickly in humid environments can last for thousands of years in the desert. We have Egyptian mummies that survived for millennia specifically because of the dry conditions. We have ancient textiles, wooden objects, even food preserved in desert tombs. So at first glance, you'd expect that bodies from 525 BCE would still exist, essentially mummified by the dry air and sand. And you'd be right, in principle they should. But preservation requires stability. It requires the body to stay in one place, undisturbed, protected from the elements. A tomb provides that stability. A grave dug deep enough provides that stability. Even a body covered by a rockfall or buried under a collapsed building might stay relatively stable for centuries. But a body lying on open sand or buried under a dune, that's a very different situation. The western desert isn't static. We've talked about this before, but it's worth emphasizing again. The sand moves constantly. Dunes migrate. What's buried today might be exposed tomorrow. What's exposed today might be buried tomorrow. Over centuries and millennia, the movement is substantial. A body buried under a meter of sand in 525 BCE might be exposed by wind erosion a century later. Exposed to the sun, to temperature extremes, to occasional rain. Yes, even the driest deserts get rain sometimes, just very rarely. The bones would bleach and crack. Scavengers, birds, foxes, insects would scatter them. Eventually, the remains might be buried again, but now they're scattered across a wider area, broken into fragments, mixed with sand and rock. Centuries pass. The process repeats. Exposure, scattering, reburial. Each cycle breaks down the remains further, spreads them wider, mixes them with sediment from different periods. After 2,500 years of this, what you'd have isn't a mass grave with 50,000 intact skeletons. What you'd have is bone fragments, potentially millions of them, scattered across dozens of square kilometers, mixed in with sand at various depths, often broken down to pieces so small they're barely recognizable as human remains. Finding such evidence would be like looking for specific grains of sand on a beach. Even with modern technology, even with systematic surveys, the chances of locating and identifying these scattered fragments would be remarkably low. Now, you might object. Surely not all the bodies would have been scattered. Surely some would have been buried deep enough to remain stable. Surely some concentration of remains should exist somewhere. And you'd be right to think so. Which brings us to another problem. We might not be looking in the right place. Think about the geography again. The Persian army left from Thebes, heading west toward Siwa, a distance of more than 400 miles. Even if we knew the exact route they intended to take, we don't know where along that route the disaster occurred. Herodotus says they were halfway between the last oasis and Siwa when the sandstorm struck. But that's not precise. It could mean anywhere within a 100-mile stretch of desert. And that's assuming Herodotus' source had accurate information, which is questionable given that there were no survivors to report the exact location. So we're searching for potential remains that could be anywhere across tens of thousands of square kilometers. Even concentrated in one location, even well preserved, such a site would be incredibly difficult to locate without either extraordinary luck or an extremely systematic and expensive survey of the entire region. But here's another possibility, one that's perhaps even more likely. There may never have been a single grave site for 50,000 men. Consider what happens when an army is caught in a catastrophic event. They don't all die simultaneously in the same spot. Some die quickly, suffocation, heat stroke, dehydration. Others survive longer, wandering in search of water or trying to escape. The army would fragment. Small groups would separate from the main body. Individuals would collapse at different points along the route. If death came from a sandstorm, the burial would be equally fragmented. Some bodies might be covered quickly in areas where sand was accumulating. Others might be exposed in areas where the wind was scouring away the surface. The distribution would be chaotic, determined by the random patterns of wind and sand movement. If death came from water scarcity, as we discussed earlier, the fragmentation would be even more pronounced. Men would die at different times over days, or even weeks. The survivors would keep moving, abandoning the dead. Bodies would be left behind at intervals along the route, scattered across the desert like tragic breadcrumbs. And if death came from military defeat, as Capper's theory suggests, the remains might be concentrated around an oasis. But oases have been continuously inhabited for thousands of years. Subsequent burials, construction, agriculture, all would disturb and obscure evidence from 525 BC. Finding and identifying remains from that specific event, buried beneath 25 centuries of accumulated human activity, would be nearly impossible. There's another factor we haven't fully considered: the possibility that some remains were found and removed long ago. The Western Desert has never been truly empty. Nomadic peoples have traveled through it for millennia. Traders, pilgrims, travelers of all kinds. If they encountered human remains, scattered artifacts, evidence of an ancient disaster, what would they have done? In some cases, perhaps nothing, leaving the remains undisturbed out of respect or superstition. In other cases, they might have buried bodies they found, performed religious rites, or simply moved on without documenting what they'd seen. Valuable objects, weapons, armor, jewelry, anything that could be reused or sold, would have been collected. This was survival in a harsh environment. You don't leave useful bronze or iron artifacts lying in the sand when you need every advantage to survive. Over 2,000 years before modern archaeology, before ideas of heritage preservation, before anyone knew or cared about Cambyses' Lost Army, the physical evidence might have been gradually picked clean, scattered, reappropriated, and absorbed into the material culture of the region. By the time archaeologists arrived in the 20th century with their scientific methods and their desire to preserve context and catalog finds, there might have been very little left to discover. This isn't satisfying. We want clear evidence. We want the spectacular archaeological discovery that proves the story true. We want to see the remains, document them, study them, finally know for certain what happened. But the desert doesn't necessarily provide that kind of closure. The conditions that preserve some things, like Egyptian tombs sealed in dry climates, can also scatter and destroy other things, like bodies left exposed on the surface in an environment of constant movement. The absence of bodies, then, doesn't necessarily prove the story false. It might simply reflect the reality of what happens to remains in the open desert over 2.5 millennia. Or it might reflect that we're asking the wrong question. Perhaps instead of, why haven't we found 50,000 bodies, we should be asking, what kind of evidence would we actually expect to find, given the conditions, the time elapsed, and the nature of the event? And the answer to that question might be, not much. Scattered fragments, occasional artifacts, tantalizing hints rather than definitive proof. Exactly, in fact, what we've been finding. The Western Desert is both a preserver and a destroyer. It can keep secrets for millennia, but it can also erase them. It can mummify bodies perfectly in tombs, but it can also scatter them to dust in the open air. Which fate befell the Lost Army of Cambyses? If indeed they existed, we may never know with certainty. The bones might be out there, buried too deep for current technology to detect, or scattered too widely to ever be comprehensively discovered, or destroyed by exposure over 2,000 years, or collected and dispersed by travelers centuries before archaeologists came looking. Or perhaps, and we must at least consider this possibility, the story is more complex than we've been told. The numbers exaggerated, the disaster less complete than Herodotus described, the truth somewhere between total annihilation and the legend that came down to us through the centuries. The lack of bodies doesn't prove or disprove anything definitively. It's just another piece of the puzzle, another question mark in a story full of them. What we're left with is uncertainty, the archaeological equivalent of absence of evidence, not being evidence of absence. We haven't found the army, but that doesn't mean they're not there. It just means the desert, vast and patient and indifferent to our questions, hasn't chosen to reveal its secrets yet. And maybe, in the end, that's appropriate. A mystery that began with an army vanishing into the sand remains mysterious, veiled by that same sand, resistant to our modern certainty and our demand for clear answers. The desert keeps its silence, and we, standing at its edge with our theories and our tools and our unanswered questions, are left to imagine what lies beneath. Chapter 10: Madness, Myth, and Memory. There's another dimension to this story that we haven't fully explored yet. Not the historical facts. Those remain frustratingly elusive. Not the archaeological evidence, which continues to evade discovery, but the narrative itself. The story as it was told, retold, and understood by the ancient world. Because the Lost Army of Cambyses isn't just a historical event. It's also a myth, a cautionary tale, a story that different cultures interpreted in different ways to make sense of power, hubris, and the relationship between humans and the divine. Let's consider what happened to Cambyses himself after the army disappeared. According to the ancient sources, primarily Herodotus, but also later historians who drew on now-lost accounts, Cambyses underwent a profound transformation. The proud conqueror, the son of Cyrus the Great, the man who had added Egypt to the Persian Empire, became something else entirely. He became mad. The stories describe increasingly erratic behavior, violent outbursts, paranoia, actions that violated not just Egyptian customs, but basic human decency. He allegedly killed his own brother, murdered his sister, and committed acts of blasphemy against Egyptian religion that horrified the local population. The most famous of these alleged crimes was the killing of the sacred Apis bull. The Apis bull was no ordinary animal. In Egyptian religion, it was the living embodiment of the god Ptah, the creator deity of Memphis. The bull was carefully selected according to specific physical markings, housed in luxury, worshipped by the people, and when it died, mummified with the same care as a pharaoh. To kill the Apis bull wasn't just cruelty to animals, it was deicide, the murder of a god in living form. Herodotus claims that Cambyses, in his madness, stabbed the Apis bull in the thigh, laughing at the Egyptians who worshipped it. The bull died from the wound, and from that moment, according to the Egyptian interpretation, Cambyses was doomed. Now, we need to be careful here. How much of this is historical fact, and how much is propaganda? The Egyptians had every reason to portray Cambyses as a monster. He was the foreign conqueror who had destroyed their independence, killed their pharaoh, occupied their land. Creating stories of his madness and sacrilege served to delegitimize his rule, to explain Egyptian suffering as divine punishment for tolerating such a blasphemer, and to maintain hope that the gods would eventually restore Egyptian sovereignty. The Greeks, writing later, had their own reasons to emphasize Cambyses' madness. It fit their narrative templates about tyrants and hubris. In Greek literature, excessive pride inevitably leads to a fall. Kings who think themselves above the laws of gods and nature are brought low, often through madness and self-destruction. So the historical Cambyses might have been quite different from the monster described in these sources. He might have been a relatively normal king dealing with the immense challenges of ruling a vast, multi-ethnic empire. Some of his actions that Herodotus describes as mad might have been rational, of brutal political decisions. But what matters for our purposes isn't whether Cambyses actually went mad. What matters is that the ancient world believed he did. And more importantly, they believed they knew why. The loss of the army. In the ancient understanding of the world, disasters on this scale weren't random. They weren't accidents of weather or logistics. They were signs, messages from the divine realm, punishments or warnings. The Egyptians saw the destruction of Cambyses' army as divine justice. The oracle of Ammonius, threatened by a foreign king who had no right to rule Egypt, had been defended by the gods themselves. Ammonius, or perhaps the collective power of Egypt's ancient deities, had reached out and annihilated the invading force. It was proof that the gods were real, that they were powerful, that they were still protecting Egypt even under foreign occupation. The army wasn't destroyed by wind and sand, or rather, the wind and sand were instruments of divine will. The storm that buried 50,000 men wasn't natural. It was supernatural. A miracle, or rather, a catastrophe directed by divine anger. This interpretation would have been deeply comforting to the Egyptian population. Yes, they were occupied. Yes, their pharaoh was dead. Yes, foreigners ruled their land. But the gods hadn't abandoned them. The gods were still powerful. The gods were fighting back in ways that mortal armies couldn't. And Cambyses' subsequent madness, real or fabricated, confirmed the pattern. First the gods destroyed his army. Then they destroyed his mind. This was how divine punishment worked, comprehensively, inexorably, leaving the transgressor alive just long enough to understand what he'd lost and why. The Greeks, meanwhile, saw the story through a different lens. For them, it was about hubris, that dangerous pride that makes humans forget their mortal limitations. Cambyses had tried to conquer everything. He'd already taken Egypt. Now he wanted to destroy an oracle, to silence prophecy itself, to demonstrate that no power, earthly or divine, could stand against Persian might. This was the classic setup for a Greek tragedy. The protagonist overreaches, challenges forces he shouldn't challenge, and is destroyed by his own arrogance. The desert, in this interpretation, wasn't just geography. It was a representation of the vast, indifferent forces that humans can't control. Nature, fate, the will of the gods. Cambyses thought he could command 50,000 men across any terrain, achieve any objective. The desert proved him wrong in the most final way possible, and the madness that allegedly followed was, in Greek understanding, entirely appropriate. The gods often drove people mad as punishment. Madness was both consequence and continuation of the transgression. You thought you were greater than the gods, so the gods take away the very rationality that makes you human, reducing you to something less than what you were. Both interpretations, Egyptian and Greek, share something important. They assumed the disaster had meaning. It wasn't random. It wasn't just bad luck or poor planning. It was punishment justice, a correction of cosmic imbalance. This is fundamentally different from how we think about such events today. Modern historians look for natural explanations, weather, logistics, military tactics. We assume disasters are the result of understandable physical causes, not divine intervention. But for the ancient world, the distinction between natural and supernatural wasn't so clear. The gods worked through nature. Storms were sent by deities. Diseases were divine punishments. Military victories reflected divine favor. The physical and metaphysical were intertwined. So when Herodotus tells us that a sandstorm buried the army, he's not necessarily describing what we would call a purely natural phenomenon. He might be describing divine action that manifested through natural means. The storm was real, physical, measurable, and also a conscious act of punishment by forces beyond human comprehension. This layered understanding of causation is something we've largely lost. We tend to see things as either natural or supernatural, scientific or religious, physical or metaphysical. Ancient peoples saw them as all of the above simultaneously. The story of the Lost Army, then, became a kind of parable, a teaching story. Different cultures used it to illustrate different lessons, but all agreed it had lessons to teach. For Egyptians, foreign conquerors might rule for a time, but the gods remain powerful and will defend their land. For Greeks, hubris leads to destruction, and no mortal, however powerful, should think themselves above the natural order. For Persians, insofar as we can infer their perspective from their silence, this was a disaster too embarrassing to discuss, a failure that had no place in the triumphant narrative of imperial expansion. The myth evolved over time, accruing details, losing others, being shaped by each generation's concerns and worldview. By the Roman period, the story was well established as a cautionary tale about the limits of power. Medieval writers knew it as an example of divine justice. Renaissance scholars debated whether it was history or legend. And through all these retellings, the core remained. An army vanished in the desert, and the king who sent them descended into madness and ruin. Whether Cambyses actually went mad, whether he killed the Apis bull, whether he committed the atrocities attributed to him, is almost beside the point. The story needed him to go mad. The narrative logic demanded it. You can't destroy an entire army in a failed attempt to silence an oracle, and then just continue on as if nothing happened. Dramatically, psychologically, morally, there has to be a reckoning. And so the sources give us one. They complete the arc: pride, transgression, disaster, madness, death. It's the structure of tragedy, the pattern of divine justice, the story the ancient world expected and therefore, in some sense, created. He died in Egypt or Syria, far from home, his conquests incomplete, his reputation in ruins, and the lost army became his epitaph, his most lasting legacy. Not the conquest of Egypt, which would be remembered as just another Persian acquisition, but the army that vanished, the mission that failed so completely it became legendary. What's fascinating is how the story survives not despite its ambiguity, but because of it. It's elastic enough to carry multiple meanings, mysterious enough to remain compelling, tragic enough to feel emotionally true, even if we can't verify its historical accuracy. The Lost Army of Cambyses exists in that strange space between history and myth, too well documented to dismiss as pure fiction, too poorly evidenced to confirm as fact, too resonant, too powerful as a narrative to fade away even after 25 centuries. And perhaps that's the real immortality, not the preservation of bodies in the sand, but the preservation of the story in human memory. The 50,000 men are gone, scattered, buried, absorbed into the desert, but the tale of their disappearance lives on, retold and reimagined by each generation. Madness, myth, and memory intertwined. The human need to make meaning from disaster, the ancient impulse to see divine purpose in catastrophe, the eternal fascination with mysteries that can't quite be solved. The desert took the army, but the story? The story escaped. It marched out of the sand and into human consciousness, where it remains, vivid and haunting, to this day. Chapter 11, the mystery that refuses to end. And so we arrive where we began, not with answers, but with questions, not with certainty, but with possibility, not with a solved mystery, but with one that continues to resist solution even after 2,500 years. It's December 2025, as I tell you this story. 25 centuries have passed since Cambyses sent his army into the western desert. 95 years since serious archaeological searches began. 16 years since the Castiglione brothers announced their controversial discovery. Countless expeditions, millions of dollars spent, thousands of hours of satellite analysis, decades of scholarly debate. And still, we have no conclusive proof of what happened to the Lost Army of Cambyses. Think about that for a moment. We live in an age where we've mapped the surface of Mars, where we've sequenced the human genome, where we can peer into the hearts of distant stars. We have technology the ancient world couldn't have imagined in their wildest dreams. Ground-penetrating radar, satellite imagery with resolution measured in centimeters, DNA analysis, carbon dating, computer modeling, artificial intelligence analyzing vast datasets for patterns human eyes might miss. And yet a mystery from 525 BCE remains unsolved. It's humbling, really. A reminder that for all our technological advancement, for all our scientific methods and analytical tools, some secrets from the past remain stubbornly hidden. The desert, it seems, is better at keeping secrets than we are at uncovering them. Let's review what we know, what we suspect, and what remains uncertain. We know, as much as we can know anything about the ancient world, that Cambyses conquered Egypt in 525 BC. This is well documented in multiple sources. The conquest happened. It's not legend. We know that the Oracle of Ammonius at Siwa existed and was religiously and politically significant. This, too, is confirmed by archaeological evidence and multiple historical sources. We know that Herodotus, writing around 430 BCE, recorded a story about a Persian army sent to Siwa that vanished in a sandstorm. This is our primary source, preserved in manuscripts copied and recopied over centuries, but ultimately traceable back to the 5th century BC. Beyond that, everything becomes speculation, theory, educated guessing. Did the army actually exist? Probably, though the exact numbers are uncertain. 50,000 might be accurate, or it might be the kind of round number ancient historians used when they didn't have precise figures. It could have been 30,000. It could have been 70,000. The core claim that a substantial military force was sent toward Siwa, Seems credible. Did it vanish? Almost certainly something catastrophic happened. The complete silence in Persian records, the fragments of Egyptian tradition, the persistence of the story across multiple cultures, all suggest a real disaster of some kind. Armies don't just disappear from history without cause. But how did it happen? This is where we enter the realm of multiple, competing theories, each with some evidence supporting it, each with problems and gaps. The sandstorm theory. Herodotus' account of a violent wind from the south burying the entire force under sand. This fits with what we know about Cambyses storms in the western desert. The paleoclimate evidence suggests the period was prone to extreme weather. It's dramatic, complete, and accounts for the lack of survivors. But we haven't found the buried remains, and the sheer completeness of the disaster. Every single man dead, not one escaping to tell the tale, strains credibility somewhat. The water scarcity theory, that the army simply got lost, missed an oasis or found one dry, and died of thirst over days or weeks. This is perhaps the most prosaic explanation, but also one of the most plausible. It requires no unusual weather, just normal desert conditions and human error in navigation or planning. It accounts for the lack of a single mass grave. Bodies would be scattered along the route. The main problem is that it's less dramatic than the sandstorm story, which raises the question of why the more mundane explanation would be inflated into legendary catastrophe. The military defeat theory. Capper's proposal that the army was ambushed and destroyed by Egyptian rebels under Petrobastus III at Dakhla Oasis. This has the advantage of explaining why both Persian and Egyptian official records are silent. It's embarrassing to the Persians and dangerous for occupied Egyptians to celebrate. The archaeological evidence at Amhida supports military activity in the right place and time, but it's circumstantial, and we don't have definitive proof connecting that activity to Cambyses' specific expedition. The exaggeration theory, that something happened to the army, but not complete annihilation. Perhaps a significant portion was lost to natural causes or military action, but survivors returned and the story grew in the telling. A disaster involving thousands becomes a disaster involving tens of thousands. A serious setback becomes total obliteration. This would explain why evidence is so scarce, because there's less of it than the legendary version suggests. But it requires us to distrust Herodotus more than most historians are comfortable doing. Each explanation fits some of the evidence. Each contradicts others. Each has its advocates and skeptics in the academic community, and none can be definitively proven with what we currently know. This is frustrating if you came here looking for answers. If you wanted me to tell you, with confidence and authority, exactly what happened to those 50,000 men, I've failed you. The mystery remains mysterious. Its administrative sophistication was centuries ahead of its time. An empire can conquer nations. This much is obvious. With sufficient military force, clever strategy, and political organization, human societies can dominate other human societies. We have thousands of years of history proving this. Empires rise and fall, but the fundamental mechanism, organized power overcoming less organized power, remains constant. The Persians understood this. They were masters of it. Nation after nation had fallen before them. Why should Egypt be different? Why should any goal be beyond their reach? But the story of the Lost Army tells us there are limits. Boundaries that even the greatest empires cannot cross. An empire cannot conquer prophecy. The oracle of Ammonius represented something that exists outside the normal power structures of human civilization. Divine speech. Sacred knowledge. Truth that claims to come from beyond human authority. You can destroy the physical sanctuary. You can kill the priests. You can burn the temples and scatter the sacred objects. But can you silence what they represent? Can you conquer the idea of divine truth? Can military force overcome spiritual authority? Cambyses tried. He sent 50,000 men to prove that even oracles bow to imperial power. And whether they were buried by sand or defeated by rebels or died of thirst or simply dispersed, the result was the same. The oracle survived. The prophecy that Cambyses had no legitimate right to rule Egypt was never silenced. In trying to conquer prophecy, the empire revealed its limits. And most fundamentally, most obviously, most humblingly, an empire cannot conquer the desert. Not the literal desert. though that's part of it. But more broadly, the empire cannot conquer nature itself, cannot overcome the basic physical realities that govern existence, cannot through sheer will or organizational ability or technological advancement transcend the limits of what's possible in a hostile environment. 50,000 men need water. The desert has no water except where it chooses to provide it. All the imperial power in the world cannot change that equation. All the military training, all the bronze weapons, all the elite soldiers, all the pride and confidence and certainty. None of it matters if you run out of water in the middle of the Great Sand Sea. This is what makes the story so enduring, I think. It's not just about one historical disaster. It's about the eternal relationship between human ambition and natural reality, between what we want to do and what we're actually capable of doing, between our plans and the universe's indifference to those plans. We live in an age of tremendous human power. We reshape landscapes, alter climates, split atoms, engineer life itself. We have more control over our environment than any previous civilization could have imagined. We've conquered diseases, crossed oceans, reached the moon. And yet, the desert remains desert. The storm remains storm. The fundamental forces that destroyed Cambyses' army, heat, thirst, disorientation, the sublime indifference of nature, these haven't changed. They can't be negotiated with, can't be defeated by superior tactics, can't be appeased through political skill. The Lost Army reminds us, gently but firmly, that for all our power, we remain small, vulnerable, mortal, subject to forces we cannot control and sometimes cannot even predict. It's a humbling message, but also, perhaps, a necessary one. Every generation needs to learn the limits of its power, needs to understand that there are boundaries beyond which confidence becomes hubris, ambition becomes folly, and the march forward becomes a march into oblivion. The Lost Army of Cambyses is teaching still. 25 centuries later, the lesson echoes across the sand, not with words, but with absence, not through what was preserved, but through what was lost. 50,000 men walked into the desert, carrying the certainty of empire. None walked out. What they left behind, or failed to leave behind, speaks more eloquently than any monument, any inscription, any triumph arch could have done. They left a question mark where an exclamation point was supposed to be. They left silence where victory songs should have sounded. They left a mystery that refuses to be solved and a story that refuses to die. And in that refusal, in that persistence, in that eternal march through the imagination of every generation that hears the tale, perhaps they found a kind of immortality after all. Not the immortality they sought, glory, conquest, empire, but a different kind. The immortality of symbol, of warning, of story. The desert wind blows. The stars shine. The sand shifts and settles and shifts again. And somewhere in that vastness, in the space between what we know and what we'll never know, the Lost Army marches still, not as soldiers anymore, not as individuals with names and faces and families, but as echo, as symbol, as reminder. The empire conquered nations, but it could not conquer prophecy, and it could not conquer the desert. Some things remain beyond the reach of power. Some mysteries resist all attempts at solution. Some stories need no ending because they're not really about what happened at the end. They're about what endures, what echoes, what refuses to be forgotten even when everything else has turned to dust. The Lost Army of Cambyses, still lost, still marching, still teaching, in the desert, in the imagination, in the eternal space between history and legend where the greatest stories make their home. Sleep well. The desert is vast, but you are here, safe and still. The mystery continues, but you can rest. The sand shifts, but you are solid ground. The echoes fade. The story rests. And so, perhaps, should you.